The latest version of string theory is called M theory, M for membrane. So we now realize that strings can coexist with membranes. So the subatomic particles we see in nature, the quarks, the electrons, are nothing but musical notes on a tiny vibrating string.
If M theory proves to be the complete theory of the universe, will it prove or disprove the idea of a benevolent creator?
M theory doesn't disprove God, but it makes him unnecessary. It predicts that the universe will be spontaneously created out of nothing, without the need for a creator. If you accept, as I do, that the laws of nature are fixed, then it doesn't take long to ask, what role is there for God? It's my view that the simplest explanation is, there is no God. No one created the universe, and no one directs our fate. This leads me to a profound realization. There is probably no heaven, and no afterlife either.
Dr. Davies, we are having this conversation because the conclusion that Dr. Hawking makes is nothing short of breathtaking and certainly controversial. Is there any reason to believe that that should be the final word on the matter?
Well, in science, nobody ever has the final word on the matter. What I think Stephen is doing here is drawing a rather obvious conclusion, that if the universe had a beginning and a Big Bang, and that there was no time before the Big Bang, and that's a crucial point, if there was nothing there before it, not even time, then the notion of a sort of cosmic magician who exists for all eternity within time and then creates the universe at some instant doesn't make sense. But that's not the God that most theologians I know talk about.
Well, there are questions, though, about what role God actually plays. Here's what theoretical physicist Dr. Michio Kaku has to say.
I believe that Stephen is going a little bit too far in saying that because time itself was born at the instant of the Big Bang, therefore there is no God. If the universe is a bubble of some sort, it's expanding, that's the Big Bang theory, but in string theory there are other universes out there. There's a multiverse of universes. Think of a bubble bath. These bubbles can collide, merge, or they can split apart into baby universes. And so we can talk, therefore, about a world before the Big Bang, a multiverse of universes. And then the question is, where did the multiverse come from? You could argue, therefore, that maybe you need a God to create the multiverse, or a creator to create string theory, perhaps.
One of the points, though, Dr. Davies, the idea of multiverses, if I understand his meaning, is, look, there may be this universe, there may be multi-universes or multiverses, something so large that science has yet to really get its collective head around it, and that's the role of the ultimate creator.
Well, now this one's easy. This multiverse follows in a very natural way. If Stephen Hawking is right, that a universe can pop into being entirely in accordance with the laws of physics, no miracles. If it can happen once, it can happen many times. So we've now moved to a picture where there is a multiverse of many universes, many Big Bangs scattered throughout space and time, and we're just in one of them. That's the fashionable view today. But you still have to explain the multiverse. That still has laws. You need a universe-generating mechanism. You need to know where those laws come from. That's where the mystery lies, the laws.
Many religious scientists credit God as the ultimate creator of all existence. Astrophysicist Dr. Jennifer Weissman is a Christian who looks to God to answer the timeless questions that science is not equipped to explain.
We do have these bigger questions of why are we here? Is there a purpose? Is there a God? And if so, what does God want for my life? These kinds of things that are outside of what science can directly address. Certainly the God that I believe in, the God of the Bible, is one who'd be responsible for whatever we find, whether it's a universe or a multiverse. None of it will surprise God.
I think the key point here is that these very laws that we're talking about, the laws that permit a universe to pop into existence, are simply, for most scientists, unexplained. But when you come to where do the laws of physics come from, most scientists say that's not part of science. You just have to accept them as a package. And in the show, Stephen Hawking gets very, very close to saying well, where do the laws of physics come from? That's where we might find some sort of God. And then he backs away and doesn't return to the subject.
Alex, literally all my life I've been obsessed by the question of why there's anything at all. And you've addressed certainly one of the subset questions, and why this universe, how this universe can emerge literally from the nothingness of the laws of physics. How does that occur, and what is the deep significance of that?
The universe has some matter content, and it has space and time. So the question is how all this came into being. You could think that it's impossible for the universe originate out of the state with no universe simply because of energy conservation. Matter has positive energy, and that is conserved. This is one of the fundamental laws of nature. However, another fundamental fact is that the energy of gravitational field is negative. And if you have a closed universe, that is the universe such that the space closes on itself, just like like a sphere, then you can show that in such a universe the negative energy of gravity exactly compensates the positive energy of matter. So the total energy of such a universe is zero. And other quantities that are conserved, like electric charge, for example, you can also show that they must be zero. Like if you put a positive charge in this spherical universe, you can follow the line of electric force, and they have to converge on another side and have a negative charge. So the total charge of a closed universe must be zero. Then, if all conserved quantities in such a universe are equal to zero, then there is no conservation law forbids creation of such a universe out of nothing, out of state where there is no matter, no space, and no time. And in quantum mechanics, anything that is not forbidden by conservation laws happens with some probability. So that's basically why a closed universe can spontaneously nucleate in quantum theory of gravity. And in fact, there is an elegant mathematical description of this process where you can try to do a calculation and try to figure out what the initial state of the universe is most likely to be in when it nucleates.
And how does quantum tunneling relate to that?
If you consider a universe filled with some, well, I should say that even if you don't have any matter in the usual sense, like particles and so forth, there is still vacuum. And for physicists, vacuum is a state which has energy and pressure. We live in a vacuum with a particularly low energy, but still non-zero. But there are other vacua which have high energy, and that's presumably the vacuum that drove inflationary expansion in the early history of the universe. So when this closed universe forms, it is filled with one of these vacua. And if you solve the Einstein's equations for a universe filled with vacuum, you discover that it describes a contracting and re-expanding universe. It kind of bounces at some small size. It cannot go smaller than that size. So that is classically forbidden according to classical Einstein's equations. However, in quantum mechanics, things that are classically forbidden by energy barriers can happen by tunneling through energy barrier. So if you have a universe of zero size, there is no universe at all, that can tunnel through energy barrier to this minimum size and start expanding. So in this classical solution of contracting and re-expanding universe, only the expanding part exists. And before that, you can have tunneling.
So quantum mechanics gets you from zero to this small size, and once you get to this small size, then you're able to use general relativity and Einstein theory to generate all the rest.
Right.
Now, this is remarkable and awesome, But it is not something from nothing, because you're starting with the laws of quantum physics, you're starting the laws of general relativity. I mean, there's a lot of somethings there. This vacuum you talk about, as you said, is pulsing with energy and fluctuations and pressure and all sorts of things. I mean, there's a lot there.
That's true, but I'm not starting with the vacuum, right? Vacuum is what comes out of it. So what I'm starting with are indeed the laws of physics, or general relativity and quantum mechanics. And of course, and these laws are assumed to exist in some sense, in some Platonic sense, even prior to the universe, although prior I should put in quotation marks because there is no time. And the question, of course, is an extremely intriguing question of why these laws, who gives the laws. It's a deep mystery, and I don't have much to say about that. I would like to.
Paul, on multiple universes, I've talked to all of our friends, everybody that you and I know who have originated and talked about multiple universes. It's enormously exciting. It's the most mind-expanding thing that I've ever confronted in my life. Everybody assumes that it's real, it's just how it works. But is it real?
I usually say 2 cheers for the multiverse, because there are good reasons of physics and cosmology for supposing that what we see may not be all you get, that there may be other regions of space and time that could be different. So it's not an unreasonable speculation. However, it falls far short of being a complete theory of existence, which is often presented as, that as if, well, if there's a multiverse, we can forget about all the mysteries of the universe because it's all explained. Everything's out there somewhere, end of story. Well, it's simply not true, because to get a multiverse, you need a universe-generating mechanism. Something has got to make all those big bangs go bang. So you're going to need some laws of physics to do that. All of the theories of the multiverse assume quantum mechanics, quantum physics, to give the element of spontaneity to make the bangs happen. They assume pre-existing space and time. They assume the normal notion of causality, a whole host of things. You write down a list, there's about 10 different basic assumptions they have to make to get the theory to work. And you can say, well, where have they all come from? What about these meta-laws that generate universes and impose effective local bylaws, as Martin Rees would call it, upon these universes? What is this distribution mechanism? How does that work? Where do those rules come from? So all you've done is shift the problem of existence up from the level of universe to the level of multiverse, but you haven't explained it. So
but if it's real, you certainly have described what a new reality is. But how strong can we believe in that reality? Even if it's hard, even if it doesn't explain everything, is that what there is that we have to explain?
Right. Now, the big problem is how do we test? How do we test this idea? It's all very well saying there are all these other universes, but is there any way of testing it? Well, it turns out there are ways of, in some sort of weak sense of testing it. We can falsify it. If you claim that a particular feature of the universe is due to the fact that only a handful of these universes in the multiverse are inhabited by beings such as ourselves who can observe these things. If you say that, that it's selected for that reason, this particular feature, there are certain statistical tests that you can apply, and if this particular feature fails those statistical tests, you can say that's evidence against the multiverse, but it is very weak. I suppose for me, the main problem is that what we're trying to do is explain why the universe is as it is by appealing to something outside of it. In this case, an infinite number of universes outside of it. And the problem about the multiverse is not that such a thing is unreasonable scientifically. It's not. It's very reasonable. It's that how on earth are we going to know about these other universes? They're not directly observable because in the fashionable view based on eternal inflation, these other universes are being conveyed apart faster than they're expanding. And so even in principle, you can't see across the gulf between them. It's possible you can apply some weak statistical tests to the fact that the universe we see may have certain features which are there because we exist, that is, that only some of these universes within this multiverse support life, and so obviously we're going to see a universe which has those features which are important for life. And there are statistical tests one can apply there. But, you know, it really is pretty feeble. And so I think the main objection, it's just a philosophical, not a scientific objection, is that what you're doing is trying to explain the universe we see by appealing to, in this case, an infinite number of universes that we don't see, appealing to something outside of the universe. And that is no better than traditional theology, which, and as a matter of fact, I believe that if somebody did a proper mathematical analysis, they would find that the complexity of the explanation of the multiverse, an infinite number of universes we don't see, is the same as the complexity of the explanation of traditional theology, an infinitely complex God outside the universe that we don't see. They're really the same thing in different language.
So how sure are we that the universe is the way that string theory describes it? Is the world really made up of strings and membranes, parallel universes, and extra dimensions? Is this all science or science fiction?
Well, the question we often ask ourselves as we work through our equations is this just fancy mathematics, or is it describing the real world?
These exercises in our imagination and mathematics are all, at the end of the day, subjected to a single question. Is it there in the laboratory? Can you find its evidence?
String theory and string theorists do have a real problem. How do you actually test string theory? If you can't test it in the way that we test normal theories, it's not science, it's philosophy. And that's a real problem.
Strings are thought to be so tiny, much smaller than an atom, that there's probably no way to see them directly.
I think it's actually stronger than that.
Okay.
That what is referred to as M theory isn't even a theory. Yes. It's a collection of ideas, hopes, aspirations.
Exactly.
It's not even a theory. And I think the book is a bit misleading in that respect. It gives you the impression that here is this new theory which is going to explain everything. It's nothing of the sort. It's not even a theory, and it certainly has no observational... partly it's this 10 to the 500 you refer to.
This is one of the interesting aspects of what he appears to be saying, is that M theory shows that the universe can create itself, so to speak, out of nothing. I mean, is that something which science can ever really tell us or be definitive? Take
It's certainly not doing it yet. I think the book suffers rather more strongly than many. I mean, it's not an uncommon thing in popular descriptions of science to latch on to some idea, particularly things to do with string theory, which have absolutely no support from observation. They're just nice ideas that people have tried to explore.
But they will always remain theoretical. I mean,
always is too strong. It may well be they just be refuted, but even that is something which is they're very far from any kind of observational
or testability.
Test, yes, they're hardly science.
I'm on my way to talk to Stephen Hawking about some of the questions we are both still asking. I want to ask him his views on evolution. As a physicist, does he think that the origin of life on Earth is just a happy coincidence?
The existence of the Earth and the properties that made it possible for biological life to develop depend on a very fine balance between the so-called constants of nature. If they were more than slightly different, either planets like the Earth would not occur, or the chemical processes necessary for life would not take place. One might take this as evidence for a divine creator, but an alternative explanation is what is known as the multiverse. The idea is that there are many possible universes. Only in the small number of universes that are suitable will intelligent beings develop and be able to ask the question, why is the universe so carefully designed?
The apparent fine-tuning of the universe is one of the hottest and indeed most controversial topics in our intellectual life today. Among physicists, argue about it among each other, philosophers, theologians, and then philosophers, theologians, and physicists all together. I want to get your sense, first of all, about the legitimacy of the question in terms of, is the universe fine-tuned, particularly the initial condition?
Well, the universe is certainly fine-tuned in the sense that the initial state of the universe was extraordinarily special. Now, there's fine-tuning in the origin of the universe, which has to do with the second law of thermodynamics. It has to have been extraordinarily precise, and in fact, it has to have been at least as precise as 1 part in 10 to the power 123. Now that's
an
ridiculous.
Extraordinary number.
It's a ridiculous number, yes. That's right. And it's nothing like, people worry about the constants of nature. You see, you want to fix those constants. Okay, they're just a few numbers. 20 numbers maybe. Yeah. And those have got to be fixed to, I don't know, just a certain amount of precision. And that's nothing by comparison with this number. The precision that we see in the initial state of the universe completely dwarfs any of these other considerations.
And that level of precision is so impossible to conceive of as from some random point of view. I mean, that's not something that you can achieve in a random fashion under any. I mean, in infinity you can do anything, but obviously, but that's
it's no explanation. I mean, that's right. I mean, you can't say, well, there are lots of universes, and out of that particular one, which we happen to be in, that number was that thing. Well, no, it doesn't explain it. You don't get anywhere close to that number.
Right. What is the implication then in terms of the generation of such incredible precision? Can the argument of multiple universes achieve that?
Well, I don't think any of these are going to. You see, it's such an improbable. We're talking about how special the Big Bang was.
Yes.
Now, you could imagine other Big Bangs which weren't so special. But, I mean, you can have other Big Bangs not so special, but that's not what we've got.
Yeah.
See?
And we're here in this one.
We're here in this one. We could have been here equally well in zillions of the other ones, you see, which weren't so special. You could have a universe which is special in our neighborhood. Our galaxy could be just as it is. But the distant universe would be different and not special out there. And that's much more likely. If you're just talking about probabilities, all these other alternatives are far more likely than the one we see, which is saying we're here and that's why the universe is as special as we see it, doesn't go anywhere to explaining the specialness of the Big Bang. It's just, it gets you nowhere because we don't need the universe to be that special for us. It's not any use to us at all why the distant universe is incredibly special and why it came from a Big Bang, which is just part of the Big Bang, which is just as special as the part we came from. And you can't say, another argument, you can't say, well, okay, you could have got lots more people by having a bigger universe. That doesn't work either, because there's lots of cheaper ways of making lots more people. You make lots of universes. And it's far cheaper in the sense of improbabilities, that's to say it's far more probable, to make lots of universes with a few people in each one than to make one universe full of people. And that's just a simple way of saying it.
In a sense, this is an even deeper mystery than the anthropic people normally put out for us.
Yes, it is, yes. No, it needs a scientific explanation. It needs a good physical theory to say why the Big Bang had that nature that it did. And we have no theory which really explains that. I mean, people usually say it's quantum gravity. No quantum gravity theory I've ever seen incorporates the asymmetry in time, which is necessary to explain why the Big Bang had this special nature and not the singular states which come from black holes, collapses, and so on. There has to be something asymmetrical, because the second law of thermodynamics is asymmetrical. And any quantum gravity theory which is going to explain why the Big Bang has this special structure has got to have that in it. And no theory I've ever seen has that character.
Michio Kaku is a theoretical physicist. As a pioneer of string theory, which proposes the world is actually 9-dimensional, He believes scientists need to keep an open mind about the sixth sense, no matter how strange it may sound.
We physicists are conservative revolutionaries in the sense that we have to be open to all sorts of crazy, bizarre phenomena. Who would have thought that there's something called radioactivity? Who would have thought that we would have quantum forces? So we have to be open to these things. The most successful physical theory of all time is called quantum mechanics, the theory of the atom, because it's based on the idea of probabilities, that you don't really know where an electron is, and electrons can exist in some sense in multiple states at the same time.
The fuzzy nature of subatomic particles might just provide a way to explain the sixth sense. Erwin Schrödinger, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, designed a thought experiment to drive home the strange rules of his theory. Let's say we put a cat and a vial of poison in a box. We add an atom of radioactive uranium and a Geiger counter. If the uranium decays, it sets off the Geiger counter, which then releases the poison and silently kills the cat. Before we open the box and look, we can't actually know whether the uranium has decayed or not, since radioactive decay is a probabilistic quantum event.
Here's the question. Is the cat dead or alive? Well, according to quantum mechanics, the cat is neither dead nor alive, but the sum of the two states. Well, at that point, you say, well, that's nonsense. That's preposterous. How can you be both dead and alive simultaneously?
Schrödinger's cat was supposed to show that nothing in this universe is certain until someone makes a measurement. But another pioneer of quantum mechanics, Eugene Wigner, believed it could teach us something else about the working of the universe, that consciousness controls everything.
Wigner said, let's take it one step farther. If I, a human being, looks at the cat, I am conscious. Therefore, consciousness determines existence. At that point, Einstein went ballistic and said, what? You're saying that the fact that you are a conscious being determines the fact that the cat is alive? Answer is yes. And Wigner made one more step. And that is, how do I know I'm alive? You see, the cat and me, we're part of the same universe. If I don't know the cat is alive or dead, I could also be dead at the same time and not even know it. So who determines that I'm alive? Well, Wigner's friend looks at me, I look at the cat, and we exist. But then who looks at Wigner's friend? And there's an infinite chain of people looking at people, until finally you hit cosmic consciousness. Some consciousness that's ethereal, that envelops the universe, which looks at us and says, aha, the cat is alive.
Wigner believed that consciousness is an inextricable part of reality, that nothing really happens in the physical world unless a conscious mind observes it.
What are your thoughts on questions of spirituality and religious questions and religious explanations for these kind of things and so forth?
Well, there is a loophole in the quantum theory.
Yeah.
As I said before, there's a quantum transition between nothing to these small bubbles.
Rather.
These bubbles start to expand.
Yeah, there's a big quantum leap from nothing to something.
Something, right.
Yeah.
However, even within the quantum principle, and I'll work in the environment in a second.
Oh, we'll get to it.
Right?
Yeah.
There is a loophole.
Yeah.
And that is that in order to make sure that you know the state of an object, like whether or not an atom has decayed or not,
Yeah.
or whether I'm even sitting here at the table,
Yeah.
you have to make a measurement.
Yeah.
And before you make a measurement, you don't really know whether the person is really there or not. There's a famous experiment of the Schrödinger's cat, which a lot of spiritualists have rediscovered in the last 10 years. If I have a box with a cat in it, and the cat is attached to a gun,
Yeah.
and the gun is attached to a Geiger counter, and the Geiger counter is attached to uranium, you don't really know whether or not the uranium atom is going to decay, set off the Geiger counter. The Geiger counter is going to set off the gun and kill the cat. If the cat's in a box, the quantum mechanical description of the cat is I have to add the live cat and the dead cat. The cat is neither alive nor dead. The cat is represented by a mathematical wave function, the sum of a dead cat and a live cat. When you open the box, you make a measurement. At that point, the cat is dead. Now, the question is, before you open the box, is the cat dead or alive? And the answer is, and this will shock you when you hear about this.
I'll get ready. Let me hold on tight. Yes.
The fact is, quantum mechanics says the cat is neither dead nor alive.
Uncertainty.
Uncertainty.
Principle.
Right.
Heisenberg. No.
Right. Now, the question is, if you have to observe something to make sure the cat is either dead or alive, this means, of course, that somebody has to do the observing.
Yes, right.
Consciousness has to open the box. Now, the question is, therefore, was there consciousness before humans?
Yeah. Oh, well, okay.
Now, Einstein asked this question. He said, this is ridiculous. He didn't believe in the quantum theory. We now know this is, of course, Einstein's great mistake. And he had a very famous interaction with a guy named Abraham Peiss. They were walking down the street one day, and he said, look at the moon. And Abraham looked at the moon, and he said, I see the moon. And he said, do you believe that the moon exists only because a mouse can look at it? Mice have been on the earth before humans.
That's right. Yeah,
Mice have looked at the moon. And he said, do you think the moon sprung into existence just because a mouse looked at it? Now, Einstein was very puzzled about this. Now, of course, the average person hearing this for the first time thinks that scientists have finally gone wacko, that this, of course, is the end of physics. Scientists have finally gotten off the deep. They're mad. But actually, this has been tested experimentally. We have atoms, atoms like cats that are neither dead nor alive. And before you look at the atom, you cannot tell whether they're dead or alive, whether they have decayed or whether they're still there or not. Okay. So in fact, the act of observing means the thing springs into existence. So in other words, did the dinosaurs really exist? Okay. Now, of course, every scientist will say, every non-quantum scientist will say, of course the dinosaurs exist. We have bones.
We do.
Right? We have bones.
All over the place.
However, a quantum physicist, and this is all serious now, will say that there is a wave function of a world where there are no dinosaurs, or dinosaurs that are still alive, or there's a wave function of dinosaurs that have bones. And before you look at the bones, you can't tell that it is physically impossible to determine whether or not there were in fact dinosaurs. Okay. Now this, of course, means that physicists have to confront the question of consciousness. And that is rather uncomfortable. We physicists don't like to talk about consciousness, especially consciousness other than human consciousness.
Yeah.
In other words, does the universe exist just because we look at it? Does the moon exist because a mouse looks at the moon?
Yeah.
Do dinosaurs' bones exist because I looked at the dinosaur bones? What about dinosaurs before humans? However, the quantum theory, and this is what bothered Einstein, brings us back to the question of who observes. Can you observe without humans? If so, does that mean that necessarily you have God, which some physicists say? Eugene Wigner, winner of the Nobel Prize, said that this essentially proves the existence of God.
The first simple question, I'll start with you, Leonard. Who created the nothing? How can something come out of nothing? Where did the nothing come from? Does there have to be a beginning?
And according to quantum theory, there is no such thing as nothingness. You can have nothingness in quantum theory, but from that, things will arise. They will pop into existence and out of existence again.
So there can be a nothing.
So there's nothing, but nothing is not stable. Things come and go from nothingness.
Wait, so there are two kinds of nothing.
I'm going to talk about three.
He's got three. You got a fourth over here? Sorry. All right. I didn't know this. All right. We have more than one nothing.
From Christian metaphysics is that God created the world out of nothing. So it's God plus nothing equals the world. And you take God out of the equation, and I'm all for that. But so now we have blank plus nothing equals the world. And what you put in the blank is the laws of nature, the laws of quantum field theory. And I think that actually in worrying too much about the problem of why there's something rather than nothing and trying to find something to put in the blank where God used to be, you're actually still in thrall to Christian metaphysics. And I think you see the laws of nature, particularly the laws of quantum field theory, very much as divine commands.
So Jim, when did philosophers start weighing in on this?
Really with Leibniz. Why is there something rather than nothing? And by nothing, he meant a state in which there are no existence at all. There are no entities, there's no chaos, there's no space, no time, absolute nothingness. It's very difficult to grasp in the imagination. And there is a genuine question, why is there a universe rather than absolute nothingness? Well, the only even remotely persuasive definition of nothing I've heard from a physicist came from Alex Vilenkin, who said, imagine a closed spherical space-time. Imagine the surface of a ball. It's a finite space, but it doesn't have any boundaries. Now imagine the ball shrinking down to a point. Its radius goes from finite, shrinks down to 0. So now you have a closed space-time of 0 radius. This was Alex Vilenkin's definition of nothingness. And he did some quantum mechanical computations and showed that given a closed space-time of 0 radius, there's a finite probability that a little nugget of false vacuum will spontaneously appear, will nucleate out of that, and that, by the miracle of inflation, will evolve into the world we see around us. And I think that's a really nice story. But there are two problems with it. One problem is a closed finite, a closed space-time of 0 radius, is that really nothing? Well, there's no space and there's no time, so anything that exists in space-time can't be a part of it. But what about physical laws? What about mathematical entities? What about consciousness, value, all the things that are possibly non-spatial, non-temporal? Those aren't ruled out, so it seems to me that the notion of nothingness is a very parochial
We'll get back. You raise a really important point that I want to get back to. What you're saying is you could have a universe that's got nothing in it, but if laws of physics still apply in that universe, the laws of physics are not nothing.
Yeah, where are the laws of physics?
Okay, why don't you like his nothing that he built his universe in?
But that's, okay.
Why don't you like his nothing?
Now the question isn't, was there something else that existed? The really amazing thing, the question that really matters, and it may not be the question that matters to some classical philosophers, but it's the question that really matters is, how did a universe of 400 billion galaxies containing 100 billion stars, how did that come into existence if there weren't galaxies, if there weren't stars, if there wasn't energy? And that is the question that physics is coming close to answering, and that may not be the ultimate question of whether there was nothing before that, but there was nothing, our universe didn't exist. And our universe coming into existence when it wasn't there in the beginning with 0 energy, but still enough gravity to create everything we see is the amazing, remarkable miracle that science creates. And that's the important question.
Yeah, it's a great story. There's lots of empirical evidence for it. You've told a miraculous story about how a universe like ours was spawned by a piece of rubber. But where did the piece of rubber come
from? No, in the multiverse.
Wait. Yeah, you said a quantum fluctuation brings the universe into existence.
That's because I can talk in our universe about quantum mechanics. But it could be, although this is wild.
Nothing else we've been talking about until now is wild. But this is wild. Okay, go.
This is even wilder. Okay, so it's quite plausible. In fact, if there are many universes, as current theory suggests, that in each of them, the laws of physics essentially come into existence when the universe comes into existence. There are different laws of physics in each universe.
Then you can't invoke a quantum fluctuation to give you the universe that has quantum fluctuation. Lawrence, just to put... so your universe that's created out of nothing, where there are no laws, no space, no time, no anything, that nothing had to know to create the universe.
Well, there may have been something else there, but our universe was
now
there.
you confess. I'm just trying to understand, because if there's no laws, then there's nothing to know to create a universe.
What if there's every law? Is that the same as no laws? That's the point.
I bet.
Well, I think Jim was sort of saying. Jim was alluding that to every possible law, every possible universe. There may be universes with no laws, or maybe universes with laws. That's certainly a possibility.
All I'm saying is, if you have a place, whatever that is,
there was no place.
If you have a no place with no laws, and then you birth a universe, something in that place had to know to birth that universe.
Why?
Okay? Purporting to offer us an explanation, and you're offering us no explanation. All you're saying, it just is.
Yeah, he's kind of doing that.
To get a universe from nothing, you've described the process, and I've heard it described before, but what you're starting with doesn't sound a lot to me like nothing. It sounds like the laws of quantum physics.
Yeah, it's a quantum foam, you know.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. So that's not nothing. That's something.
That means something, but it's nothing in the sense of that there is no geometry in particular,
Right.
because our universe has a geometry.
Yes, there's no geometry, but it is a geometry generating mechanism.
In principle, yeah, there could be through the tunneling you generate this.
And
now, mind you, as I said from the beginning, this is all speculation.
Of course,
we don't know how this
we like
happened.
speculation. That's
Yes.
okay. But my concern is it's speculation and very interesting, and it may be right, but it's not answering the question. The question is, why is there something rather than nothing? And you're
and my answer is that I do not know. I only can say that.
Because you're starting with...
According to the laws of physics that I know,
Right.
this was possible.
Right.
But why it is, I don't know.
Right, but the laws of physics, if we have quantum physics, which is the generator, whether it's the indeterminate principle or whatever it is that is part of the quantum physics, is very complicated. But it is complicated, it is something, and it's a lot of stuff. Maybe it'll be reduced down to something even more simple in string theory, or who knows. But quantum field theory is a lot of things going on to make that. And so, if you start with that, and you have a mechanism to generate a universe with geometries and everything else, but you're starting with something pretty rich.
Right. Well, you start with some laws.
Some laws.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you're right. So the question is, why are there some laws? And again, I don't know the answer to that.
Well, the existence of nothing. Okay. Yes.
So in my book, Dark Around the Dinosaurs, I have a section on cosmology, and I actually talk about the probability of nothing. And I think nothing is just very unlikely. I mean, first of all, we wouldn't talk about nothing because we wouldn't be here. But nothing is just one. If you think of a number line, 0 is just one point on it. And nothing is just, I would say, is very unlikely. And if you have an explanation of why there's nothing, then there's something there that allowed you to have the rules that explain it.
So you're saying the act of posing the question of why there's something is proof that there could not have been nothing?
Right, so there's two answers.
Crystal clear now.
That's one answer, and the other answer is probabilistic.
So it seems to me that there was surely a time when nothing was just, I would say there's nothing between me and you. Then we learned that there's air, there's actual substance there, there's mass, there's energy, and so you couldn't call that nothing anymore. And then we learned that space has no air, and that's a relatively recent understanding. As late as the early 1600s, there were arguments that maybe you could fly to the moon, and by learned scientists. And the only way you could do that is if this air substance permeated the space between us and the moon. So now that when there's no air, so then space is the nothing, but then quantum physics, relativity tells us there's stuff going on even in empty space. So that removes that from our nothingness. And now we have to actually exit the universe. And I just wonder whether this nothing is an all-elusive moving target, that one day we will learn that you do create those universes out of a law of physics. It's the universe birthing law. And then there's a law in the place where we previously thought there was nothing. And then that just simply pushes the definition of nothing that much farther away that you have to chase it down, because then the space that has the law that we previously thought was nothing that birthed the universe, you can then ask, what birthed that?
Matter originates in accordance with laws of nature, quantum laws, which must have existed before there was any matter, because the matter comes into existence in accordance with the quantum laws. So it cannot be true that they think the laws just describe how matter acts. On the contrary, the laws tell matter how it's going to act, and the laws actually create matter. You know, some of my colleagues like to talk very misleadingly about these days we believe in the bootstrap theory of the universe. And the bootstrap theory is the universe pulls itself into being by its own bootstraps. In other words, out of nothing. You get creation out of nothing. But it's not nothing. You've got the laws of quantum physics, and they're not matter either, and they exist in order to produce the universe. So modern physics has got itself into a state where it cannot be materialistic. That's the irony of materialism, that materialists think they're being scientific, but quantum physicists say, well, actually, matter is very mysterious sort of stuff, and it originates from something beyond the material.
Matter is really an appearance of mind. Using the word mind rather broadly, something conscious, something intelligent, but consciousness is the important point. So there may be a material world, but if there is, it's an expression of an underlying and more real and more truly existent conscious world. And a lot of quantum physicists, not all, but I think the majority, see consciousness as much more important than matter. So let's just start with that thought of idealism, that consciousness is an ineliminable, you can't get rid of it, part of reality, and that probably it's more fundamental than matter is. Indeed, matter is nothing but an appearance of some form of consciousness. Who says this? Oh, right, let me give you some names. Heisenberg is probably the person, well, he is the person who formed the first quantum theory in 1925. What Heisenberg said in 1925 is, there are no such things as little lumps or billiard balls or planets circling around the nucleus of an atom. That picture is dead. We still get it in books because it's something you can sort of imagine, but it's very misleading. There are no such things. So what are electrons? Well, that's where it begins to get difficult. What are electrons? Well, they are actually different when they're being observed and when they're not being observed. When they're being observed, they act, this is according to quantum physics, I'm not just making this up. When electrons are being observed, they are particles at a specific location. I mean, when you actually see one, it's a little particle which has hit a phosphor screen, getting onto this screen. You can see on a photograph the impact, and it's a particle impact. You don't see the particle actually, but you see what the particle has done. You see where it's hit the screen. You say the particle hit it there. So they have a precise location. And in that sense, they're quanta, or particles. The trouble is when they're not being observed, they aren't particles. That's the real trouble. They are probability waves. What's a probability wave? That's what nobody knows. It's a mathematical construct, really. The wave, if you draw a wave like that, the wave gives you the probability that if you made an observation, you would find a particle at a particular place. All right? So it's not a real wave like something on the sea. It's not like that. It's a mathematical wave, and it gives you a probability that you might find a particle at a particular wave. In fact, slightly more technical, I'm not going to get very technical, but the square of the amplitude of a wave, that is from top to bottom of the wave, the square of the amplitude of a wave gives you the probability of the location at which a particle will be found if you have an experimental interference with the wave. Okay. So that's what an electron is. It's quite simple, really. No wonder they don't teach it in schools, though. They don't even teach it in first-year physics. You don't do quantum until you're a postgraduate, because it's much too difficult. So probability waves, you say, what does the world really consist of? Your electrons, your small billiard balls, have disappeared. They only exist when you observe them. And what's really there, when you're not looking, is probability waves. And probabilities aren't actualities, they're just probabilities. So if you say, where is the electron when we're not looking at it? Do you remember Bishop Berkeley, who said, where is everything when we're not looking at it? Berkeley had the view that to be is to be perceived. Anything which is only exists if it's being perceived. Color is a good example of this. We look around this room now, and we see lots of colors in this room. But in fact, if we left the room, if all of us left the room, there would be no colors in the room at all, because the realities with which physics deals have no color. Color is the product of an interaction between a light wave, that's a real wave, not a probability one, between a light wave and the electrochemical impulses in the brain which the light wave produces when it hits the retina of your eye. So color is, we might say, subjective. Now, everybody agrees with that, don't you? Yes, I'm sure you do. So color doesn't exist in the external world. There are just waves of various frequencies. Depending on the frequency, when it hits the brain, you see a different color. And of course, if your visual apparatus is not attuned to those wavelengths, you wouldn't see these colors at all. And many animals see in black and white when they don't have, and some animals see infrared that we can't see at all. And Bishop Berkeley said, look, you see all these colors in this room, go out of the room, and what color will things be? No color at all. Color will not exist. Now, electrons are like that. They only exist if you're looking at them. Or more technically, if you're making an experimental interference, which collapses the probability wave into a particle. Right? But then you've got to look at it to see that. So if you're not looking, electrons don't exist. Only probability waves exist. Well, now, what this is coming up with is the view, accepted by many, but not all, quantum physicists, the view that actually subatomic particles only exist when they're being looked at. Otherwise, they don't exist at all. Does anything exist? Let me give you a few quotations. You may not be believing me already, and it's going to get much worse. But let me give you some quotations from some very notable quantum physicists. John Wheeler, Nobel Prize-winning physicist, says, no elementary phenomenon is real unless it is observed. Just think about that. We know about all these particles, electrons, protons, neutrons, gravitons, hundreds of them, and Wheeler says none of them exist unless it's being observed. And people who talk about matter being the thing out of which minds somehow evolve are as wrong as they could possibly be, because matter is only in the mind. And if there weren't any minds, there wouldn't be any matter. Well, that's John Wheeler. You may think he's a nutcase, but Eugene Wigner, another Nobel Prize-winning physicist, says, study of the external world, he means in quantum physics, often called the new physics, because it's so different from Newton and even from Einstein, really. Eugene Wigner says, study of the external world leads to the conclusion that contents of consciousness are the ultimate reality. It's the same point. If you ask what is ultimately real, the answer is that which is a content of some consciousness. Now remember Bishop Berkeley again. Bishop Berkeley said, yes, things are real only when they're being observed. And you ask the question, well, what if nobody's looking? And Berkeley said, well, I'm a bishop, and I can tell you that God is always looking. So things are what they are because they're being observed by God. If there wasn't a God, there wouldn't be anything. Von Neumann, yet another, they're all Nobel. All the people I'm going to quote are Nobel Prize winners, so they must be good at something. Von Neumann says, all real things are contents of consciousness. We see traces of it in CERN, in Geneva, marks left by particles which have been going round and round this vast tube at very fast speeds. But we never see the things themselves, and that's not surprising, because there aren't any. There is only a purely mathematical reality. And we haven't got a clue what that would be like. But whatever it's like, it's not material. So that's the end of materialism. And there's a little book by John Gribbin, perfectly respected scientific writer, and Paul Davies, mathematical physicist from Melbourne, Australia, called The Matter Myth, in which they just bring out the findings of this new physics. It's not anything like matter. Because Einstein contributed to this debate with his famous formula, which the one formula in physics that everybody knows, E equals mc squared, but nobody knows what it means. But what it does mean, all right, at the simplest level is energy equals mass, matter, times the square of the speed of light. Okay. In other words, mass, matter, and energy are convertible. Matter is only one form of energy. There are other forms of it as well. Now, that in itself is a world-shaking conclusion. Matter, far from being the fundamental reality, is just one form of energy. And there may be other forms. In fact, we do know some other forms that there are. There's antimatter, for a start. And there are other things, too. And from Heisenberg himself, and Heisenberg is really the great name, he formulated the first quantum theory. Since then, there have been others, Paul Dirac of Cambridge and Schrödinger, who propounded the Schrödinger equations, which quantum physicists use. But Heisenberg is the originator, really. And he said, elementary particles, that's electrons, protons, neutrons, and so on, elementary particles form a world of pure possibilities. Atoms, he said, are not things. Right? So possibilities, not things. So from a quantum point of view, the world doesn't consist of very small things bumping into each other. In fact, you have to say there are no things. There are only possibilities, possibilities of perception. Now, what do you make of that? Well, one thing you could say, and people like Eugene Wigner do say, well, this shows that the whole of reality is a construct of mind. It's constructed by mind. And what mind could it be than the mind of God? So the mind of God becomes integral to science. It's not that you say, could we have an argument from physics to God? It's that physics is about God. That's what it's about. And people like Niels Bohr, there is a super intelligent cosmic mind, and matter only exists within that. And we see matter in a particular way as particles, elementary particles, and that depends on the nature of our consciousness. Quantum physicists don't all believe in God. They don't want to mislead you. And those who do believe in a cosmic mind might not call it God because they don't like what goes on in synagogues and churches and things like that. So they may say, I don't like the word God. Let's just talk about a cosmic mind. But to me, it's pretty close.
And there are quantum physicists like John Wheeler, very famous quantum physicist, who says actually the Big Bang didn't exist until somebody thought of it. Right? The Big Bang wouldn't exist unless somebody thought of it, and that somebody, guess what, was God.
It may seem crazy to doubt that our concept of reality is true, but I think to find the meaning of life, we must answer the question, is there an independent reality or not?
Well, at first, it would seem to be bad news. If reality itself is just a model in each individual brain, where can the meaning be? What's more, perhaps there is no real reality out there at all. I don't think that one reality is more valid than another. And that means that reality itself is in the mind of the beholder. Meaning itself is simply another piece of the model of reality that we each build inside our own brain. Right and wrong are part of the universe we create in our minds, just as a table, a planet, or a galaxy. The meaning of life is what you choose it to be.
Meaning can only ever exist within the confines of the human mind. And in this way, the meaning of life is not somewhere out there, but right between our ears. In many ways, this makes us the lords of creation.
Sir Martin Rees of the Institute of Astronomy in Cambridge and the Astronomer Royal is not impressed. I know Stephen Hawking well enough to know that he has read very little philosophy and even less theology, and so I don't think we should attach any weight to his views on this topic. Hawking and Mlodinow opened their book, The Grand Design, with a series of profound questions. What is the nature of reality? Where did this all come from? Did the universe need a creator? And then they say, traditionally, these are questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. Philosophy has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. Now, as a professional philosopher, I could only roll my eyes at the audacity of such a statement. Two scientists who have, to all appearances, little acquaintance with philosophy are prepared to pronounce an entire discipline dead and to insult their faculty colleagues in philosophy at Caltech and Cambridge University, many of whom, like Michael Redhead and D.H. Mellor, are eminent philosophers of science, for supposedly failing to keep up. Their pronouncement is not merely amazingly condescending, but also outrageously naive. The man who claims to have no need of philosophy is the man most apt to be deceived by it. You might therefore anticipate that Hawking and Mladenov's subsequent exposition of their favorite theories would be underpinned by a host of unexamined philosophical presuppositions, and that expectation is in fact borne out. Their claims about laws of nature, the possibility of miracles, scientific determinism, and the illusion of free will are all asserted with only the thinnest of justification. Clearly, Mladenov and Hawking are up to their necks in philosophical questions. What you might not expect, however, is that after pronouncing the death of philosophy, Hawking and Mladenov should themselves then plunge immediately into a philosophical discussion of scientific realism versus anti-realism. I thought philosophy was supposed to be dead, but the first third of their book is not about current scientific theories at all, but is a disquisition on the history and philosophy of science. I found this section to be the most interesting and mind-boggling of the entire book. Let me explain. Having set aside a Monday afternoon to read Hawking and Mladenov's book, I spent that morning working through an article from Blackwell's Contemporary Debates in Metaphysics on a philosophical viewpoint known as ontological pluralism. Ontological pluralism. Now, what is that? Ontological pluralism is a view in an area of philosophy whose name sounds like stuttering, metaphysics, or as it's sometimes called, meta-ontology. This is philosophy at its most ethereal. Ontology is the study of being, or of what exists, the nature of reality. Meta-ontology is one step higher. It inquires whether ontological disputes are meaningful and how best to resolve them. Ontological pluralism holds that there really is no right answer to many ontological questions, such as, do composite objects exist? According to the ontological pluralist, these are just different ways of describing reality, and none of these is more correct or accurate than another. There literally is no fact of the matter to answer these questions. So, if you were to ask, for example, is there such a thing as the moon? The ontological pluralist would say that the question has no objective answer. It's not true that the moon exists, and it's not true that the moon does not exist. There just is no fact of the matter about whether there is such a thing as the moon. Ontological pluralism is thus a radical view which is defended by only a handful of contemporary philosophers. Imagine my astonishment, therefore, to find Hawking and Mladenov espousing ontological pluralism, without, of course, being aware of the name, as their answer to the question, what is the nature of reality? They call their view model-dependent realism. They explain that models are just different ways of interpreting our sense perceptions. On their view, there is no objective reality out there to which our models of the world more or less accurately correspond. Mlodinow and Hawking are thus, in fact, extreme anti-realists. Now, you can't help wonder, but what sort of argument would justify adopting so radical a view? All that Mlodinow and Hawking have to offer is the fact that if we were, say, inhabitants of a virtual reality controlled by alien beings, then there would be no way for us to tell that we were in the simulated world, and so we would have no reason to doubt its reality. The trouble with this sort of argument is that it doesn't exclude that there are, in this case, two competing models of the world. One, the aliens' model, and the other, our model, and one of the models is real, and the other one is illusory, even if we can't tell which is which. Moreover, the fact that our observations are model-dependent doesn't imply that we cannot have knowledge of the way the world is, much less that there is no way the world is. For example, a layperson entering the Cavendish laboratory might see that there's a piece of machinery on the lab table, but he would not see that there's an interferometer on the lab table, since he lacks the theoretical knowledge to recognize it as such. A caveman entering the laboratory wouldn't even see that there's a piece of machinery on the table, since he lacks the concept of a machine. But that does nothing to undermine the objective truth of the lab technician's observation that there is an interferometer on the table. Hawking and Mlodinow, not content with ontological pluralism, really go off the deep end when they assert, and I quote, "There is no model-independent test of reality. It follows that a well-constructed model creates a reality of its own," end quote. Now, this is an assertion of ontological relativity, the view that reality itself is different for persons having different models. If you're Fred Hoyle, then the universe really has existed eternally in a steady state. But if you're Rodger Penrose, then the universe really did begin with a Big Bang. If you're the ancient physician Galen, blood really does not circulate through the human body. But if you're William Harvey, who discovered circulation, it really does. Now, such a view seems crazy and is made so only more so by Hawking and Mlodinow's claim that the model itself somehow creates its respective reality. The main point is that despite their claim to speak as scientific torchbearers of knowledge, what Hawking and Mlodinow are engaged in is philosophy. The most important conclusions drawn in their book are philosophical, not scientific. Why then do they pronounce philosophy dead and claim as scientists to be bearing the torch of discovery? Simply because that enables them to cloak their amateurish philosophizing with the mantle of scientific authority, and so avoid the hard work of actually arguing for their positions rather than merely asserting their philosophical viewpoints. For that reason, I am frankly not terribly impressed when scientists begin to pronounce on questions of philosophy and theology. For when they do so, they are speaking outside of their area of specialization, and their opinions have no more value than the opinions of an untutored layman. Indeed, they are untutored laymen when it comes to these questions, for scientists typically lack any training in philosophy and theology. With that in mind, let's look now more closely at Hawking and Mlodinow's answer. Why does something exist rather than nothing? There, they explain that there is a constant vacuum energy contained in empty space. And if the universe's positive energy associated with matter is evenly balanced by the negative energy associated with gravitation, then the universe can come spontaneously into being as a fluctuation of the energy in the vacuum, which by a clever sleight of hand, they say, we may as well call zero. Now, this seems to be a very different account of the universe's origin, for it presupposes the reality of space and the energy in it. So it's puzzling when Mlodinow and Hawking conclude, and I quote, because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing in the manner described in chapter 6. Here, it's said that the nothingness spoken of in chapter 6 is not really nothingness after all, but is space filled with vacuum energy. But space filled with vacuum energy is hardly nothing, and certainly doesn't exist prior to the South Pole in the model. All this goes to reinforce the conviction that the no-boundary approach only describes the evolution of our universe from its origin at the South Pole to its present state, but is silent as to why the universe came to exist in the first place. What this implies is that Hawking hasn't even begun to address the question, why is there something rather than nothing? For nothing, in his vocabulary, does not have the traditional meaning of non-being, but rather means the quantum vacuum. Hawking and Mlodinow's equivocal use of terms is painfully evident in their interview with the American television host Larry King on his program. Here is how it went. Hawking, gravity and quantum theory cause universes to be created spontaneously out of nothing. Larry King, who created the nothing? Where did the nothing come from? Mlodinow, according to quantum theory, there is no such thing as nothingness. Now, in this ridiculous exchange, Hawking is using nothing to refer to the quantum vacuum, while Mlodinow is using it to mean non-being. And they avoid the tough question, why is there something rather than nothing, only by equivocating on the use of their terminology. In conclusion, then, despite Hawking and Mlodinow's constant sniping at religious belief throughout their book, I think there is actually genuine profit in it for religious believers, especially for those interested in natural theology. For the authors affirm and argue for an absolute beginning of time and the universe, which points ineluctably to a transcendent cause beyond the universe. Consider first the Kalam cosmological argument. 1. If the universe began to exist, then there is a transcendent cause which brought the universe into existence. 2. The universe began to exist. 3. Therefore, there is a transcendent cause which brought the universe into existence. By the universe, I mean that reality which is studied by contemporary cosmology. That is to say, all contiguous physical reality which currently takes the form of space-time and its contents. I take it that 1 is obviously true. Rather, the truly controversial premise is 2. Traditional supporters presented philosophical arguments in support of 2, which for me constitute its primary warrant. Rather, what's emerged during the 20th century is a remarkable empirical confirmation of the second premise from the evidence of astrophysical cosmogony. 2 independent but closely interrelated lines of physical evidence support premise 2. Evidence from the expansion of the universe and evidence from the second law of thermodynamics. Even many who have expressed skepticism about premise 2 admit that it is more plausibly true than not. For example, in my recent dialogue with Lawrence Krauss, he volunteered, "I bet our universe had a beginning, but I am not certain of it. Based on the physics that I know, I'd say it is a more likely possibility." This is to admit precisely what cosmologists like Alexander Vilenkin have contended all along, that the evidence makes it more likely than not that the universe began to exist. Consider first evidence from the expansion of the universe. The standard Big Bang cosmogonic model implies that the universe is not infinite in the past, but had an absolute beginning a finite time ago. Although advances in astrophysical cosmology have forced various revisions in the standard model, nothing has called into question its fundamental prediction of the finitude of the past and the beginning of the universe. Indeed, as James Sinclair has shown, the history of 20th century cosmogony has seen a parade of failed theories trying to avert the absolute beginning predicted by the standard model. Meanwhile, a series of remarkable singularity theorems has increasingly tightened the loop around empirically tenable cosmogonic models by showing that under more and more generalized conditions, a beginning is inevitable. In 2003, Arvin Bord, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to show that any universe, which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history, cannot be infinite in the past, but must have a beginning. In 2012, Vilenkin showed that cosmogonic models, which do not fall under this condition, fail on other grounds to avert the beginning of the universe. Vilenkin concluded, none of these scenarios can actually be past eternal. All the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning. The Bord-Guth-Vilenkin theorem proves that classical spacetime, under a single, very general condition, cannot be extended to past infinity, but must reach a boundary at some time in the finite past. Now, either there was something on the other side of that boundary or not. If not, then that boundary is the beginning of the universe. If there was something on the other side, then it will be a non-classical region, described by the yet-to-be-discovered theory of quantum gravity. In that case, Vilenkin says, it will be the beginning of the universe. Think about it. If there is such a non-classical region, then it is not past eternal in the classical sense, but neither can it exist literally timelessly, akin to the way in which philosophers consider abstract objects to be timeless, or theologians take God to be timeless. For this region is in a state of constant flux, which, given the indiscernibility of identicals, is sufficient for time. So even if time as defined in classical physics does not exist at such an era, some sort of time would. But if the quantum gravity era is temporal, it cannot be extended infinitely in time. For such a quantum state is not stable, and so would either produce the universe from eternity past or not at all. As Anthony Aguirre and John Kihayas argue, it is very difficult to devise a system, especially a quantum one, that does nothing forever, then evolves. A truly stationary or periodic quantum state, which would last forever, would never evolve, whereas one with any instability will not endure for an indefinite time. Hence, the quantum gravity era would itself have to have had a beginning in order to explain why it transitioned just some 13 billion years ago into classical time and space. Hence, whether at the boundary or at the quantum gravity regime, the universe probably began to exist. Consider now the evidence of thermodynamics. According to the second law of thermodynamics, entropy in a closed system almost never decreases. Given the naturalistic assumption that the universe is a closed system, The second law implies that given enough time, the universe will come to a state of thermodynamic heat death, whether cold or hot. Given that the universe will expand forever, it may never reach a state of equilibrium, but will grow increasingly cold, dark, dilute, and dead. But then the obvious question arises: why, if the universe has existed forever, is it not now in a cold, dark, dilute, and lifeless state? PCW Davies gives the obvious answer. The universe can't have existed forever. We know there must have been an absolute beginning a finite time ago. The universe's energy, says Davies, was simply put in at the creation as an initial condition. By contrast, Professor Carroll's solution to the problem confronts serious obstacles. He imagines that the overall condition of the universe is a state of thermal equilibrium, a sort of de Sitter space, but that random fluctuations spawn baby universes which pinch off to become wholly independent spacetimes. We find ourselves in one such baby universe in a state of disequilibrium. Let me raise two concerns about this model. First, not only are the production mechanisms of such baby universes admittedly conjectural, but such a scenario violates the so-called unitarity of quantum theory by allowing irretrievable information loss from the mother universe to the babies. Stephen Hawking, apologizing to science fiction fans everywhere, came to admit, "There is no baby universe branching off. As I once thought, the information remains firmly in our universe." Second, Professor Carroll's solution provides no convincing answer to the Boltzmann brain problem. Since the mother universe is a de Sitter space in which thermal fluctuations occur, and since baby universes grow into de Sitter spaces themselves, there's no explanation in the model why there exists a genuine low entropy universe around us rather than the mere appearance of such a world, an illusion of isolated brains which have fluctuated into existence out of the quantum vacuum. These and other problems make Professor Carroll's model less plausible than the standard solution that the universe began to exist with an initial low entropy condition. Skeptics might hope that quantum cosmology might serve to avert the implications of the second law of thermodynamics. But now, a new singularity theorem formulated by Aaron Wall seems to close the door on that possibility. Wall shows that given the validity of the generalized second law of thermodynamics in quantum cosmology, the universe must have begun to exist, unless, as in Professor Carroll's model, one postulates a reversal of the arrow of time at some point in the past, which, he rightly observes, involves a thermodynamic beginning in time, which would seem to raise the same sorts of philosophical questions that any other sort of beginning in time would. Wall reports that his results require only certain basic concepts so that it is reasonable to believe that the results will hold in a complete theory of quantum gravity. Thus, we have good evidence, both from the expansion of the universe and from the second law of thermodynamics, that the universe is not past eternal, but had a temporal beginning. So the second premise of the Kalam cosmological argument receives significant confirmation from the evidence of contemporary cosmology. We have then a good argument for a transcendent cause of the universe.
Why does anything at all exist? Gottfried Leibniz wrote, "The first question which should rightly be asked is, why is there something rather than nothing?" He came to the conclusion that the explanation is found in God. Someone might say, if everything that exists needs an explanation, what about God? Doesn't he need an explanation? And if God doesn't need an explanation, then why does the universe need an explanation? To address this, Leibniz makes a key distinction between things that exist necessarily and things that exist contingently. Things that exist necessarily exist by necessity of their own nature. It's impossible for them not to exist. Many mathematicians think that abstract objects like numbers and sets exist like this. They're not caused to exist by something else, they just exist by necessity of their own nature. Things that exist contingently are caused to exist by something else. Most of the things we're familiar with exist contingently. They don't have to exist. They only exist because something else caused them to exist. There's no reason to think the world around us had to exist. If the universe had developed differently, there might have been no stars or planets. It's logically possible that the whole universe might not have existed. It doesn't exist necessarily, it exists contingently. If the universe might not have existed, why does it exist? The only adequate explanation for the existence of a contingent universe is that its existence rests on a non-contingent being, something that cannot not exist because of the necessity of its own nature. It would exist no matter what. So, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. But what about our second premise? Is it reasonable to call the explanation of the universe God? Well, what is the universe? It's all of space-time reality, including all matter and energy. It follows that if the universe has a cause of its existence, that cause cannot be part of the universe. It must be non-physical and immaterial, beyond space and time. The list of entities that could possibly fit this description is fairly short, and abstract objects cannot cause anything. Leibniz's contingency argument shows that the explanation for the existence of the universe can be found only in the existence of God. Or, if you prefer not to use the term God, you may simply call him the extremely powerful, uncaused, necessarily existing, non-contingent, non-physical, immaterial, eternal being who created the entire universe and everything in it.
More abstract argument for the existence of God is the first cause argument. Let's just look at the simple, basic, intuitive, natural, commonsensical form of it. I think we all have to become rather clever in order to doubt it or to dispute it, because it's based on an instinctive mind that we all share. The instinct that says everything needs an explanation. Nothing just is, without a reason why it is. Everything that exists has some adequate or sufficient reason why it exists. Philosophers call this the principle of sufficient reason. We use it every day, in common sense and in science, as well as in philosophy. If you saw a rabbit suddenly appear on this empty table, you would not blandly say, "Hi there, rabbit, you came from nowhere, didn't you?" No, you'd look for a cause. You would assume there has to be some cause. We never deny the principle of sufficient reason itself. No one believes the pop theory, that things just pop into existence for no reason at all. Perhaps we will never find the cause, but there must be a cause for everything that comes into existence. Now, the entire universe is a vast interlocking chain of things that come into existence. Each of these things must therefore have a cause. My parents caused me, my grandparents caused them, etc. But it is not that simple. I would not be here without billions of causes, from the Big Bang through the cooling of the galaxies and the evolution of the protein molecule to the marriages of my ancestors. The universe is a vast and complex chain of causes. Now, does the universe as a whole have a cause? Is there a first cause, an uncaused cause, an eternal cause, a transcendent cause of the whole immanent chain of causes? If not, then there is an infinite regress of causes with no first link in the great cosmic chain. If so, then there is an eternal, necessary, independent, self-explanatory being with nothing above it, nothing before it, nothing supporting it. It would explain itself as well as everything else. For if it needed something else as its explanation, its reason, its cause, then it would not be the first and uncaused cause. Such a being could be called God. If we can prove there is such a first cause, we will have proved that there is some sort of God. Now, why must there be a first cause? Because if there isn't, then the whole universe is unexplained, and we have violated our principle of sufficient reason for everything. If there is no first cause, each particular thing in the universe is explained by some other thing, but the universe as a whole is not explained. Everyone and everything in the universe says in turn, don't look to me for the final explanation. I'm just an instrument. Something else caused me. But if that's all there is, beings that say that, then we have an endless buck-passing universe. God is the one who says the buck stops here. One more analogy. Suppose I tell you there is a book that explains everything you want explained. You want that book very much. You ask me whether I have it. I say, no, I have to get it from my wife. Does she have it? Well, no, she has to get it from a neighbor. Does he have it? No, he has to get it from his teacher, who has to get it from, etc., ad infinitum. No one actually has the book. In that case, you will never get it. However long or short the chain of book borrowers may be, you will get the book only if someone actually has it and does not have to borrow it. Well, existence is like that book. Existence is handed down the chain of causes, from cause to effect. If there is no first cause, no being who is eternal and self-sufficient, no being who has existence by his own nature and does not have to borrow it from something else, then the gift of existence can never be passed down the chain to others, and no one will ever get it. But we did get it. We exist. We got the gift of existence from our causes down the chain, and so did every actual being in the universe, from atoms to archangels. Therefore, there must be a first cause of existence, a God. The thing to do is to return to what is sure and clear, the intuitive point I began with. Not everyone can understand all the abstract details of the first cause argument, but everyone can understand its basic point. C.S. Lewis puts it this way, I felt in my bones that this universe does not explain itself.
If one asks what caused God, the answer is that nothing could bring into being a reality which wholly transcends space-time and which is self-existent. To fail to grasp such an idea is to fail to grasp what God is. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Something cannot come into being out of nothing.
This is rooted in the metaphysical idea that being cannot come from non-being. Out of nothing, nothing comes.
But if something is eternal and timeless, then it doesn't fall under that first premise. It doesn't need a cause. Even atheists like Daniel Dennett recognize that if eternal verities exist, like numbers or mathematical objects, they don't need a cause because they never come into being. They don't begin to exist. And the concept of God is the concept of an eternal, self-existent, necessary being, and therefore the answer is simply that God is uncaused. He is self-existent.
That's the personal God. Einstein did not believe that the God of the universe created us just so you can get that wagon for a Christmas present. You see, Einstein believed in another God, the God of Spinoza, the God of Leibniz, the God of order, harmony. The universe could have been random. It could have been chaotic. It could have been messy. But the universe is actually quite elegant, quite simple, and in fact is gorgeous. You can put the laws of physics as we know them on a simple sheet of paper. Amazing. Didn't have to be that way. Therefore, you ask the question, is the existence of God provable? Well, what is science? Science is based on things that are testable, reproducible, and falsifiable. But you see, the existence of God is not testable. It's not reproducible. You cannot reproduce God at will. You cannot put an angel inside a box and demand that miracles take place. It doesn't work that way. That's why religion is based on faith, rather than things that are objectively testable, falsifiable, and reproducible. Now, that doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. I don't know. I don't know if God exists or not. All I'm saying is that science is limited by looking at what is testable, reproducible, and falsifiable. There are areas where you push the boundaries of that, like the Big Bang. You cannot reproduce the Big Bang. You cannot test the Big Bang. It's like a detective story. You can only look at the clues left over from the Big Bang. So to calculate the instant of creation is in some sense outside science, because it's not reproducible. You cannot reproduce the Big Bang. But you can then trace the history of what happened afterwards, like a murder mystery, and that's where a lot of science is done. And that's why I say that the existence of God is not within the normal boundaries of science.
In addition to the fact that the world is fine-tuned, that we can understand it, it is that the world operates according to laws. And that's an astonishing thing that we are so used to that we don't realize how amazing it is that the world operates according to fixed laws. That alone should awaken our wonder. But I want to remind you that science is not the only mode of knowing. It's not the only paradigm for understanding. In fact, everybody here, in that which matters most to you in your life, relies on something other than science. Why do you get up in the morning? Is life worth living? Whom do you choose to love, and why do you believe love matters? Those are not scientific questions, and yet you live your life by those questions. We shouldn't think that if you can't put it in a test tube, or you can't see it in a microscope, or you can't spot it in a telescope, then it doesn't matter and it doesn't exist. We live our lives by intangibles, by poetry, by love, by dreams, by aspiration, and these things are not susceptible to repeat experiments.
Morality to say that these are dimensions of human experience which give you insight into a transcendent reality which is not physical, and that's what I'd call the spiritual dimension.
The question of the correct foundation of morality is one that is not only of tremendous academic interest, but also one that has enormous practical application for our lives. To say that moral values and duties are objective is to say that they are valid and binding independent of human opinion. For example, to say that the Holocaust was objectively evil is to say that it was evil even though the Nazis who carried it out thought that it was good. And it would still have been evil even if the Nazis had won World War II and succeeded in brainwashing or exterminating everyone who disagreed with them so that everybody thought the Holocaust was good. The question before us this evening, then, is what is the best foundation for the existence of objective moral values and duties? What grounds them? What makes certain actions objectively good or evil, right or wrong? Consider first the question of objective moral values. If God does not exist, then what basis remains for the existence of objective moral values? To try to ground moral values in the natural world. But how can you do that, since nature in and of itself is just morally neutral? On a naturalistic view, moral values are just the behavioral byproducts of biological evolution and social conditioning. Just as a troop of baboons exhibit cooperative and even self-sacrificial behavior because natural selection has determined it to be advantageous in the struggle for survival, so their primate cousins, Homo sapiens, have evolved a sort of herd morality for precisely the same reasons. As a result of sociobiological pressures, there has evolved among Homo sapiens a sort of herd morality which functions well in the perpetuation of our species. But on the atheistic view, there doesn't seem to be anything that makes this morality objectively binding and true. The philosopher of science, Michael Roos, reports, the position of the modern evolutionist is that humans have an awareness of morality because such an awareness is of biological worth. Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. If there is no God, then any reason for regarding the herd morality evolved by Homo sapiens on this planet as objectively true seems to have been removed. Take God out of the picture, and all you seem to be left with is an ape-like creature on a speck of dust beset with delusions of moral grandeur. Richard Dawkins' assessment of human worth may be depressing, but why, on atheism, is he mistaken when he says there is at bottom no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference? We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason. Does atheism provide a sound foundation for objective moral duties? Duty has to do with moral obligation or prohibition, what I ought or ought not to do. First, natural science tells us only what is, not what ought to be the case. As philosopher Jerry Fodor has written, science is about facts, not norms. It might tell us how we are, but it wouldn't tell us what is wrong with how we are. In particular, it cannot tell us that we have a moral obligation to take actions which are conducive to human flourishing. So, if there is no God, what foundation remains for objective moral duties? On the naturalistic view, human beings are just animals, and animals have no moral obligations to one another. When a lion kills a zebra, it kills the zebra, but it doesn't murder the zebra. When a great white shark forcibly copulates with a female, it forcibly copulates with her, but it doesn't rape her. For none of these actions is forbidden or obligatory. There is no moral dimension to these actions. So if God does not exist, why think we have any moral obligations to do anything? Who or what imposes these obligations upon us? Where did they come from? It's very hard to see why they would be anything more than a subjective impression ingrained into us by societal and parental conditioning. On the atheistic view, certain actions such as rape and incest may not be biologically and socially advantageous, and so in the course of human development have become taboo. That is, socially unacceptable behavior. But that does absolutely nothing to prove that such acts are really wrong. Such behavior goes on all the time in the animal kingdom. On the atheistic view, the rapist who chooses to flout the herd morality is doing nothing more serious than acting unfashionably, the moral equivalent, if you will, of Lady Gaga. If there is no moral lawgiver, then there is no objective moral law. And if there is no objective moral law, then we have no objective moral duties. Second problem, ought implies can. A person is not morally responsible for an action which he is unable to avoid. For example, if somebody shoves you into another person, you're not responsible for bumping into him. You had no choice. But Sam Harris believes that all of our actions are causally determined and that there is no free will. Dr. Harris rejects not only libertarian accounts of free will, but also compatibilistic accounts of freedom. But if there is no free will, then no one is morally responsible for anything. Moral responsibility, he says, and I quote, is a social construct, not an objective reality. I quote, "In neuroscientific terms, no person is more or less responsible than any other for the actions they perform." His thoroughgoing determinism spells the end of any hope or possibility of objective moral duties, because on his worldview, we have no control over what we do. In the absence of the ability to do otherwise, there is no moral responsibility. In the absence of freedom of the will, we are just puppets or electrochemical machines. And puppets do not have moral responsibilities. Machines are not moral obligations. So there isn't even the possibility of moral duty on his view. Thus, on Dr. Harris's view, there is no source of objective moral duties because there is no moral lawgiver, and no possibility of objective moral duty because there is no free will. Therefore, on his view, despite his protestations to the contrary, right and wrong do not really exist. On atheism, I don't see any reason to think we have any moral duties to do anything. Moral obligations or prohibitions arise in response to imperatives from a competent authority. For example, if a policeman tells you to pull over, then because of his authority, who he is, you are legally obligated to pull over. But if some random stranger tells you to pull over, you're not legally obligated to do so. Now, in the absence of God, what authority is there to issue moral commands or prohibitions? There is none on atheism, and therefore there are no moral imperatives for us to obey. And I'm maintaining that in the absence of God, there isn't any reason, any explanation for the existence of objective moral values. Which I was defining the term, I mean valid and binding, independent of human opinion. On atheism, it's hard to see how it couldn't be anything more than a subjective fact. Moral ontology asks, what is the foundation of objective moral values and duties? Moral semantics asks, what is the meaning of moral terms? And I am not making any kind of semantical claim tonight. Rather, my concern is moral ontology. What is the ground or the foundation of moral values and duties? To give an illustration, think of light. Light is a certain visible range of the electromagnetic spectrum, but obviously that isn't the meaning of the word light. People knew how to use the word light long before they discovered its physical nature. And I might also add, they certainly knew the difference between light and darkness long before they understood the physics of light. Now, in exactly the same way, we can know the meaning of moral terms like good and evil, right and wrong, and know the difference between good and evil without being aware that the good is grounded in God ontologically. So that is the position I'm defending tonight, is that moral values are grounded ontologically in God. Second, our moral duties are grounded by God's commandments, which are necessary reflections of his nature. To conclude, I want to quote from a remarkable article that appeared in the Duke Law Journal by Arthur Allen Leff called Unspeakable Ethics, a Natural Law. Dr. Leff's difficulty is to find a foundation for moral values and duties, in this case for the law, that would be independent of human opinion, would be objective and would be in the world, and he can't find one. He says, any attempt to ground values in the world is open to the playground bully's retort, who says? And this is how his article concludes. All I can say is this, it looks as if we are all we have. Only if ethics were something unspeakable by us, that is something transcendent, could law be unnatural and therefore unchallengeable. As things now stand, everything is up for grabs. Nevertheless, napalming babies is bad. Starving the poor is wicked. Buying and selling each other is depraved. There is in the world such a thing as evil. Who says?
Newtonian determinism says that the universe is a clock, a gigantic clock that's wound up at the beginning of time, and it's been ticking ever since according to Newton's laws of motion. So, what you're going to eat 10 years from now, on January 1st, has already been fixed. It's already known using Newton's laws of motion. Einstein believed in that, Einstein was a determinist. Does that mean that a murderer, a horrible mass murderer, isn't really guilty of his works because it was already preordained billions of years ago? And Einstein said, well, yeah, in some sense that's true. Even mass murderers were predetermined. But he said they should still be placed in jail. Heisenberg then comes along and proposes the Heisenberg uncertainty principle and says, nonsense. There's uncertainty. You don't know where the electron is. It could be here, here, or many places simultaneously. This, of course, Einstein hated because he said God doesn't play dice with the universe. Well, hey, get used to it. Einstein was wrong. God does play dice. Every time we look at an electron, it moves. There's uncertainty with regards to the position of the electron. So what does that mean for free will? It means in some sense we do have some kind of free will. No one can determine your future events given your past history. There's always the wild card. There's always the possibility of uncertainty in whatever we do.
So Dr. Schloss, you mentioned earlier the uniqueness of man. I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit more as to whether or not you think that man is unique, and if so, how?
The question is, if you couldn't hear it, do I think that human beings are unique, and if so, how? And I have to say I do. I have to confess I have a theological commitment, pre-commitment to that, but I actually think the biology itself is really fascinating on this. Not all my colleagues do. So Franz de Waal, for example, an anthropologist, a primatologist, argues that really strongly that there are no fundamental differences between humans and other organisms, including morality, by the way. He says that we have no fundamental wants or needs that are not shared by our nearest primate ancestors. I'd point you to this fascinating debate between de Waal and Jerome Kagan, a developmental psychologist at Harvard, who has no religious pre-commitment. He says, you're just crazy on this. Kagan says that, and he really does say so in almost those words, he said that he believes that human beings have evolved, that they're fundamentally biological, no supernatural hocus pocus involved, but that, quote unquote, the human beings are incommensurate with our nearest primate ancestors. What Kagan would say, what I would agree with, is one example of that is the capacity to feel guilt, which involves recalling past actions, evaluating them in the light of a moral standard, recognizing we could have chosen differently, and regretting the choice that we made. So I think that's one difference. I think another difference is altruism, the ability to give without expectation of return. I'm not the only biologist who thinks that. E.O. Wilson, famous evolutionary biologist at Harvard, calls this the quote-unquote scandal, culminating mystery of biology. Richard Dawkins, maybe the most famous evolutionary biologist and atheist in the world, points this out as being, well, he has even stronger words. He says, this has never existed before in the whole history of the world. It has no place in nature. Quote unquote, we alone are able to rebel against the tyranny of our selfish replicators.
I never felt so human when I felt guilty. Anyhow, go ahead.
Hi. I actually had a totally different question, but that really, I really want to respond to that and hope I can get a little bit more out of you. Based on that, a guy like Richard Dawkins, who wrote The Selfish Gene, talks about altruism in a genetic sense because, as he understands it and as many scientists understand it, natural selection, as we sort of now, maybe we say no, maybe we can say theorize, works at the genic level. And because natural selection works at the genic level, we can say that altruism, even altruism without any expectation, possible hope of return, is not without biological foundation, is not without genetic foundation, is not this thing that makes us special, this thing that makes us different, that makes us elevated above other creatures. And I think that, I mean, quoting Richard Dawkins in favor of saying that we're special as a result of this notion of altruism is a fundamental misunderstanding, misreading of Dawkins' work. I mean, the idea that just because we are able to get beyond altruism as thinking beings, and he says, yes, we're being able to get beyond, we're so smart that we can go past altruism, doesn't mean that altruism doesn't have a genetic basis. Doesn't mean that it's not an evolutionary construct.
So what's the question?
Oh, no, let me no, I get the question.
I really
First of all, thank you for feeling free to challenge. That's what and thank you for doing it in such a winsome and respectful way. So let me respond. I don't think that's a misreading of Dawkins at all. The way a biologist defines altruism is, and this is a difference between biologists and psychologists or moral theorists, is not in terms of motivations, but in terms of consequences. Here's the biological definition of altruism. It's a behavior in which the actor increases the fitness of the recipient at the net cost to fitness of the actor. If there's a gene underlying that behavior, that gene can't exist. So with
did you say can or can't?
It cannot exist, because if there's a gene causing me to behave in a way that increases your fitness and decreases my fitness, that gene is going to die out. So Dawkins' whole point in The Selfish Gene is not that altruism has a genetic basis, but that it can't have a genetic basis, and it doesn't. Now, how does Dawkins, and then biologists have two responses. One response is to say, okay, there's no altruism. And bless his heart, I really mean this, Dawkins doesn't take that route. He thinks there actually, some places he expresses a little ambivalence, other places he doesn't. But he grants the possibility that altruism does exist, and how could it exist? His solution in the last chapter of The Selfish Gene is to posit some other influence on behavior, which he calls memes. And that was a direct quote from Dawkins, "We alone on Earth have the capacity to resist the tyranny of the selfish replicators." How do we do that? Well, by the way, I mean, I don't know how you could say that's a quote taken out of context, "we alone on Earth." But Dawkins' proposal, and here's where I want to be very clear, Dawkins is not saying Darwin's wrong, he's not saying evolution's wrong, he's not even saying that hyper-Darwinian interpretations of evolution are wrong, which proposes that natural selection proposes everything, explains everything. All he's saying is that for humans, and at least in that book, only humans, natural selection operates on genes, but it also operates on memes. Memes basically are non-genetic pieces of information. You might think of them as culturally transmitted ideas. That makes us unique. Does it make us unique in a way that confers to us qualities, and most of us would say moral qualities, that no other animal shares? Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Means that we trace conscience to a biological instinct. W.H. Auden writes, "We must love one another or die." We unconsciously know this, just as animals unconsciously know that unless they behave in certain ways, the species will not survive. That's why animal mothers sacrifice for their children. And that's a sufficient explanation for human altruism, too. It's simply the herd instinct. Well, the problem with that explanation is that it does not account for the absoluteness of conscience's authority. We believe we ought to disobey an instinct, any instinct, on some occasions, but we do not believe that we ought ever to disobey our conscience. You should usually obey instincts like mother love, but not if it means keeping your son back from risking his life to save his country in a just and necessary defensive war, or if it means injustice and lack of charity to other mothers' sons. There is no instinct that should always be obeyed. The instincts, C.S. Lewis says, are like the keys on a piano, and the moral law is like sheet music. Different notes are right at different times. In other words, the relativity of instincts presupposes the absoluteness of the music. Honest introspection, I think, will reveal to anyone that conscience is not simply an instinct. When the alarm wakes you up early and you realize that you promised to help your friend this morning, your instincts pull you back to bed. But something quite different from your instincts tells you to get up. Even when you feel two instincts pulling you, for instance, you're both hungry and tired, the conflict between these two instincts is quite different and can be felt to be quite different from the conflict between conscience and either or both of those instincts. Conscience tells you that you ought to do or not do something, while instincts simply drive you to do or not do something. Conscience is a pull, instincts are pushes. Instincts make something attractive or repulsive to your appetites, but conscience makes something obligatory to your choice, no matter how your appetites feel about it. I think most people will admit this piece of obvious introspective data if they are honest. If they try to wiggle out of the argument at this point, we must leave them alone with the question. And I think if they're honest, they'll confront the data when they're alone.
We have good grounds for accepting our moral experience. When I talk to folks, 99% of people will say to me, yes, I think there is an objective difference between torturing a child for fun and loving that child and caring for it, that these are not morally indifferent acts. And I simply say, why distrust that moral intuition?
Now this law, or rule, about right and wrong, used to be called the law of nature. Nowadays, when we talk of the laws of nature, we usually mean things like gravitation, or heredity, or the laws of chemistry, the law of human nature. The idea was that, just as all bodies are governed by the law of gravitation, and organisms by biological laws, so the creature called man also had his law, with this great difference, that a body could not choose whether it obeyed the law of gravitation or not, but a man could choose either to obey the law of human nature or to disobey it. We may put this in another way. Each man is at every moment subjected to several different sets of laws, but there is only one of these which he is free to disobey. As a body, he is subjected to gravitation and cannot disobey it. If you leave him unsupported in mid-air, he has no more choice about falling than a stone has. As an organism, he is subjected to various biological laws which he cannot disobey any more than an animal can. That is, he cannot disobey those laws which he shares with other things. But the law which is peculiar to his human nature, the law he does not share with animals or vegetables or inorganic things, is the one he can disobey if he chooses. This law was called the law of nature because people thought that everyone knew it by nature and did not need to be taught it. They did not mean, of course, that you might not find an odd individual here and there who did not know it, just as you find a few people who are colorblind or have no ear for a tune. But taking the race as a whole, they thought that the human idea of decent behavior was obvious to everyone. And I believe they were right. If they were not, then all the things we said about the war were nonsense. What was the sense in saying the enemy were in the wrong, unless right is a real thing, which the Nazis at bottom knew as well as we did and ought to have practiced? If they had had no notion of what we mean by right, then, though we might still have had to fight them, we could no more have blamed them for that than for the color of their hair. Think of a country where people were admired for running away in battle, or where a man felt proud of double-crossing all the people who had been kindest to him. You might just as well try to imagine a country where 2 and 2 made 5. But they have always agreed that you ought not to put yourself first. Selfishness has never been admired. A nation may say treaties do not matter, but then next minute they spoil their case by saying that the particular treaty they want to break was an unfair one. But if treaties do not matter, and if there is no such thing as right and wrong, in other words, if there is no law of nature, what is the difference between a fair treaty and an unfair one? Have they not let the cat out of the bag and shown that, whatever they say, they really know the law of nature just like anyone else? It seems, then, we are forced to believe in a real right and wrong. People may sometimes be mistaken about them, just as people sometimes get their sums wrong. But they are not a matter of mere taste and opinion any more than the multiplication table. Other people wrote to me saying, "Isn't what you call the moral law just a social convention, something that is put into us by education?" I think there is a misunderstanding here. The people who ask that question are usually taking it for granted that if we have learned a thing from parents and teachers, then that thing must be merely a human invention. But of course that is not so. We all learned the multiplication table at school. A child who grew up alone on a desert island would not know it. But surely it does not follow that the multiplication table is simply a human convention, something human beings have made up for themselves and might have made different if they had liked. I fully agree that we learn the rule of decent behavior from parents and teachers and friends and books, as we learn everything else. But some of the things we learn are mere conventions, which might have been different. We learn to keep to the left of the road, but it might just as well have been the rule to keep to the right. And others of them, like mathematics, are real truths. The question is to which class the law of human nature belongs. There are two reasons for saying it belongs to the same class as mathematics.
The first is, as I said in the first chapter, that though there are differences between the moral ideas of one time or country and those of another, the differences are not really very great, not nearly so great as most people imagine, and you can recognize the same law running through them all, whereas mere conventions, like the rule of the road or the kind of clothes people wear, may differ to any extent. The other reason is this. When you think about these differences between the morality of one people and another, do you think that the morality of one people is ever better or worse than that of another? Have any of the changes been improvements? If not, then of course there could never be any moral progress. Progress means not just changing, but changing for the better. If no set of moral ideas were truer or better than any other, there would be no sense in preferring civilized morality to savage morality, or Christian morality to Nazi morality. In fact, of course, we all do believe that some moralities are better than others. We do believe that some of the people who tried to change the moral ideas of their own age were what we would call reformers or pioneers, people who understood morality better than their neighbors did. Very well then. The moment you say that one set of moral ideas can be better than another, you are in fact measuring them both by a standard, saying that one of them conforms to that standard more nearly than the other. But the standard that measures two things is something different from either. You are, in fact, comparing them both with some real morality, admitting that there is such a thing as a real right, independent of what people think, and that some people's ideas get nearer to that real right than others. Or put it this way. If your moral ideas can be truer, and those of the Nazis less true, there must be something, some real morality, for them to be true about. The reason why your idea of New York can be truer or less true than mine is that New York is a real place, existing quite apart from what either of us thinks. If, when each of us said, New York, each meant merely the town I am imagining in my own head, how could one of us have truer ideas than the other? There would be no question of truth or falsehood at all. In the same way, if the rule of decent behavior meant simply whatever each nation happens to approve, there would be no sense in saying that any one nation had ever been more correct in its approval than any other. No sense in saying that the world could ever grow morally better or morally worse. None of us are really keeping the law of nature. I am only trying to call attention to a fact. The fact that this year, or this month, or more likely this very day, we have failed to practice ourselves the kind of behavior we expect from other people. There may be all sorts of excuses for us. The time you were so unfair to the children was when you were very tired. That slightly shady business about the money, the one you have almost forgotten, came when you were very hard up. And what you promised to do for old so-and-so and have never done, well, you never would have promised if you had known how frightfully busy you were going to be. And as for your behavior to your wife, or husband, or sister, or brother, if I knew how irritating they could be, I would not wonder at it. And who the dickens am I anyway? I am just the same. That is to say, I do not succeed in keeping the law of nature very well, and the moment anyone tells me I am not keeping it, there starts up in my mind a string of excuses as long as your arm. The question at the moment is not whether they are good excuses. The point is that they are one more proof of how deeply, whether we like it or not, we believe in the law of nature. If we do not believe in decent behavior, why should we be so anxious to make excuses for not having behaved decently? The truth is, we believe in decency so much, we feel the rule of law pressing on us so that we cannot bear to face the fact that we are breaking it, and consequently we try to shift the responsibility. For you notice that it is only for our bad behavior that we find all these explanations. It is only our bad temper that we put down to being tired or worried or hungry. We put our good temper down to ourselves. These, then, are the 2 points I wanted to make. First, that human beings all over the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way, and cannot really get rid of it. Secondly, that they do not in fact behave in that way. They know the law of nature, they break it. These 2 facts are the foundation of all clear thinking about ourselves and the universe we live in. There were 2 odd things about the human race. First, that they were haunted by the idea of a sort of behavior they ought to practice, what you might call fair play, or decency, or morality, or the law of nature. Second, that they did not, in fact, do so. When you say that falling stones always obey the law of gravitation, is not this much the same as saying that the law only means what stones always do? You do not really think that when a stone is let go, it suddenly remembers that it is under orders to fall to the ground. You only mean that, in fact, it does fall. In other words, you cannot be sure that there is anything over and above the facts themselves, any law about what ought to happen, as distinct from what does happen. The laws of nature, as applied to stones or trees, may only mean what nature in fact does. But if you turn to the law of human nature, the law of decent behavior, it is a different matter. That law certainly does not mean what human beings in fact do, for as I said before, many of them do not obey this law at all, and none of them obey it completely. The law of gravity tells you what stones do if you drop them, but the law of human nature tells you what human beings ought to do and do not. In other words, when you are dealing with humans, something else comes in above and beyond the actual facts. You have the facts, how men do behave, and you also have something else, how they ought to behave. Now this is really so peculiar that one is tempted to try to explain it away. For instance, we might try to make out that when you say a man ought not to act as he does, you only mean the same as when you say that a stone is the wrong shape, namely that what he is doing happens to be inconvenient to you. But that is simply untrue. A man occupying the corner seat in the train because he got there first, and a man who slipped into it while my back was turned and removed my bag are both equally inconvenient. But I blame the second man and do not blame the first. I am not angry, except perhaps for a moment before I come to my senses, with a man who trips me up by accident. I am angry with a man who tries to trip me up even if he does not succeed. Yet the first has hurt me and the second has not. Sometimes the behavior which I call bad is not inconvenient to me at all, but the very opposite. In war, each side may find a traitor on the other side very useful, but though they use him and pay him, they regard him as human vermin. So you cannot say that what we call decent behavior in others is simply the behavior that happens to be useful to us. And as for decent behavior in ourselves, I suppose it is pretty obvious that it does not mean the behavior that pays. It means things like being content with 30 shillings when you might have got £3, doing schoolwork honestly when it would have been easy to cheat, leaving a girl alone when you would like to make love to her, staying in dangerous places when you could go somewhere safer, keeping promises you would rather not keep, and telling the truth even when it makes you look a fool. Some people say that though decent conduct does not mean what pays each particular person at a particular moment, still it means what pays the human race as a whole, and that, consequently, there is no mystery about it. Human beings, after all, have some sense. They see that you cannot have real safety or happiness except in a society where everyone plays fair, and it is because they see this that they try to behave decently. Now, of course, it is perfectly true that safety and happiness can only come from individuals, classes, and nations being honest and fair and kind to each other. It is one of the most important truths in the world. But as an explanation of why we feel as we do about right and wrong, it just misses the point. If we ask, why ought I to be unselfish, and you reply, because it is good for society, we may then ask, why should I care what's good for society, except when it happens to pay me personally? And then you will have to say, because you ought to be unselfish, which simply brings us back to where we started. You are saying what is true, but you are not getting any further. If a man asked what was the point of playing football, it would not be much good saying, in order to score goals, for trying to score goals is the game itself, not the reason for the game. And you would really only be saying that football was football, which is true, but not worth saying. In the same way, if a man asks what is the point of behaving decently, it is no good replying, in order to benefit society, for trying to benefit society, in other words, being unselfish, for society after all only means other people, is one of the things decent behavior consists in. All you are really saying is that decent behavior is decent behavior. You would have said just as much if you had stopped at the statement, men ought to be unselfish. And that is where I do stop. Men ought to be unselfish, ought to be fair. Not that men are unselfish, nor that they like being unselfish, but that they ought to be. The moral law, or law of human nature, is not simply a fact about human behavior in the same way as the law of gravitation is, or may be, simply a fact about how heavy objects behave. On the other hand, it is not a mere fancy, for we cannot get rid of the idea, and most of the things we say and think about men would be reduced to nonsense if we did. And it is not simply a statement about how we should like men to behave for our own convenience, for the behavior we call bad or unfair is not exactly the same as behavior we find inconvenient, and may even be the opposite. Consequently, this rule of right and wrong, or law of human nature, or whatever you call it, must somehow or other be a real thing. A thing that is really there, not made up by ourselves. And yet it is not a fact in the ordinary sense, in the same way as our actual behavior is a fact. It begins to look as if we shall have to admit that there is more than one kind of reality, that in this particular case there is something above and beyond the ordinary facts of men's behavior, and yet quite definitely real, a real law, which none of us made, but which we find pressing on us. Let us sum up what we have reached so far. In the case of stones and trees and things of that sort, what we call the laws of nature may not be anything except a way of speaking. When you say that nature is governed by certain laws, this may only mean that nature does, in fact, behave in a certain way. The so-called laws may not be anything real, anything above and beyond the actual facts which we observe. But in the case of man, we saw that this will not do. The law of human nature, or of right and wrong, must be something above and beyond the actual facts of human behavior. In this case, besides the actual facts, you have something else, a real law which we did not invent and which we know we ought to obey. I now want to consider what this tells us about the universe we live in. Ever since men were able to think, they have been wondering what this universe really is and how it came to be there. View is the religious view. According to it, what is behind the universe is more like a mind than it is like anything else we know. That is to say, it is conscious and has purposes and prefers one thing to another. And on this view it made the universe, partly for purposes we do not know, but partly, at any rate, in order to produce creatures like itself. I mean, like itself to the extent of having minds. But why anything comes to be there at all, and whether there is anything behind the things science observes, something of a different kind, this is not a scientific question. If there is something behind, then either it will have to remain altogether unknown to men, or else make itself known in some different way. The statement that there is any such thing, and the statement that there is no such thing, are neither of them statements that science can make. And real scientists do not usually make them. It is usually the journalists and popular novelists who have picked up a few odds and ends of half-baked science from textbooks who go in for them. After all, it is really a matter of common sense. Supposing science ever became complete so that it knew every single thing in the whole universe, is it not plain that the questions, why is there a universe, why does it go on as it does, has it any meaning, would remain just as they were? Now the position would be quite hopeless but for this. There is one thing, and only one, in the whole universe which we know more about than we could learn from external observation. That one thing is man. We do not merely observe men, we are men. In this case we have, so to speak, inside information. We are in the know. And because of that, we know that men find themselves under a moral law, which they did not make and cannot quite forget even when they try, and which they know they ought to obey. Notice the following point. Anyone studying man from the outside, as we study electricity or cabbages, not knowing our language and consequently not able to get any inside knowledge from us, but merely observing what we did, would never get the slightest evidence that we had this moral law. How could he? For his observations would only show what we did, and the moral law is about what we ought to do. In the same way, if there were anything above or behind the observed facts in the case of stones or the weather, we, by studying them from outside, could never hope to discover it. The position of the question, then, is like this. We want to know whether the universe simply happens to be what it is for no reason, or whether there is a power behind it that makes it what it is. Since that power, if it exists, would not be one of the observed facts, but a reality which makes them, no mere observation of the facts can find it. There is only one case in which we can know whether there is anything more, namely our own case. And in that one case we find there is. Or put it the other way round. If there was a controlling power outside the universe, it could not show itself to us as one of the facts inside the universe. no more than the architect of a house could actually be a wall or staircase or fireplace in that house. The only way in which we could expect it to show itself would be inside ourselves, as an influence or a command trying to get us to behave in a certain way. And that is just what we do find inside ourselves. Surely this ought to arouse our suspicions. In the only case where you can expect to get an answer, the answer turns out to be yes. And in the other cases where you do not get an answer, you see why you do not. Suppose someone asked me, when I see a man in a blue uniform going down the street leaving little paper packets at each house, why I suppose they contain letters, I should reply, because whenever he leaves a similar little packet for me, I find it does contain a letter. And if he then objected, but you've never seen all these letters which you think the other people are getting, I should say, of course not, and I shouldn't expect to, because they're not addressed to me. I'm explaining the packets I'm not allowed to open by the ones I am allowed to open. It is the same about this question. The only packet I am allowed to open is man. When I do, especially when I open that particular man called myself, I find that I do not exist on my own, that I am under a law, that somebody or something wants me to behave in a certain way. I do not, of course, think that if I could get inside a stone or a tree, I should find exactly the same thing, just as I do not think all the other people in the street get the same letters as I do. I should expect, for instance, to find that the stone had to obey the law of gravity, that whereas the sender of the letters merely tells me to obey the law of my human nature, he compels the stone to obey the laws of its stony nature. But I should expect to find that there was, so to speak, a sender of letters in both cases, a power behind the facts, a director, a guide, and which appears in me as a law urging me to do right, and making me feel responsible and uncomfortable when I do wrong. I think we have to assume it is more like a mind than it is like anything else we know, because after all, the only other thing we know is matter, and you can hardly imagine a bit of matter giving instructions, with the idea that in the moral law, somebody or something from beyond the material universe was actually getting at us. And I expect when I reached that point, some of you felt a certain annoyance. You may even have thought that I had played a trick on you, that I had been carefully wrapping up to look like philosophy what turns out to be one more religious jaw. You may have felt you were ready to listen to me as long as you thought I had anything new to say, but if it turns out to be only religion, well, the world has tried that and you cannot put the clock back. If anyone is feeling that way, I should like to say 3 things to him. First, as to putting the clock back. Would you think I was joking if I said that you can put a clock back, and that if the clock is wrong, it is often a very sensible thing to do? But I would rather get away from the whole idea of clocks. We all want progress, but progress means getting nearer to the place where you want to be. And if you have taken a wrong turning, then to go forward does not get you any nearer. If you are on the wrong road, progress means doing an about turn and walking back to the right road. And in that case, the man who turns back soonest is the most progressive man. We have all seen this when doing arithmetic. When I have started a sum the wrong way, the sooner I admit this and go back and start over again, the faster I shall get on. There is nothing progressive about being pig-headed and refusing to admit a mistake. And I think if you look at the present state of the world, it is pretty plain that humanity has been making some big mistake. We are on the wrong road. And if that is so, we must go back. Going back is the quickest way on. We have 2 bits of evidence about the somebody. One is the universe he has made. If we used that as our only clue, then I think we should have to conclude that he was a great artist, for the universe is a very beautiful place. But also that he is quite merciless and no friend to man, for the universe is a very dangerous and terrifying place. The other bit of evidence is that moral law which he has put into our minds. And this is a better bit of evidence than the other, because it is inside information. You find out more about God from the moral law than from the universe in general, just as you find out more about a man by listening to his conversation than by looking at a house he has built. Now, from this second bit of evidence we conclude that the being behind the universe is intensely interested in right conduct, in fair play, unselfishness, courage, good faith, honesty, and truthfulness. In that sense we should agree with the account given by Christianity that God is good. But do not let us go too fast here. The moral law does not give us any grounds for thinking that God is good, in the sense of being indulgent or soft or sympathetic. There is nothing indulgent about the moral law. It is hard as nails. It tells you to do the straight thing, and it does not seem to care how painful or dangerous or difficult it is to do. If God is like the moral law, then he is not soft. It is no use at this stage saying that what you mean by a good God is a God who can forgive. Only a person can forgive. If it is pure, impersonal mind, there may be no sense in asking it to make allowances for you or let you off, just as there is no sense in asking the multiplication table to let you off when you do your sums wrong. You are bound to get the wrong answer. And it is no use either saying that if there is a God of that sort, an impersonal, absolute goodness, then you do not like him and are not going to bother about him. For the trouble is that one part of you is on his side and really agrees with his disapproval of human greed and trickery and exploitation. You may want him to make an exception in your own case, to let you off this one time, but you know at bottom that unless the power behind the world really and unalterably detests that sort of behavior, then he cannot be good. On the other hand, we know that if there does exist an absolute goodness, it must hate most of what we do. That is the terrible fix we are in. If the universe is not governed by an absolute goodness, then all our efforts are in the long run hopeless. But if it is, then we are making ourselves enemies to that goodness every day, and are not in the least likely to do any better tomorrow, and so our case is hopeless again. We cannot do without it, and we cannot do with it. God is the only comfort. He is also the supreme terror, the thing we most need and the thing we most want to hide from. He is our only possible ally, and we have made ourselves his enemies. Some people talk as if meeting the gaze of absolute goodness would be fun. They need to think again. They are still only playing with religion. Goodness is either the great safety or the great danger, according to the way you react to it. And we have reacted the wrong way. Now my third point. When I chose to get to my real subject in this roundabout way, I was not trying to play any kind of trick on you. I had a different reason. My reason was that Christianity simply does not make sense until you have faced the sort of facts I have been describing. Christianity tells people to repent and promises them forgiveness. It therefore has nothing, as far as I know, to say to people who do not know that they have done anything to repent of, and who do not feel that they need any forgiveness. It is after you have realized that there is a real moral law and a power behind the law, and that you have broken that law and put yourself wrong with that power, it is after all this, and not a moment sooner, that Christianity begins to talk. When you know you are sick, you will listen to the doctor. When you have realized that our position is nearly desperate, you will begin to understand what the Christians are talking about. They offer an explanation of how God can be this impersonal mind at the back of the moral law, and yet also a person. They tell you how the demands of this law, which you and I cannot meet, have been met on our behalf, how God himself becomes a man to save man from the disapproval of God. All I am doing is to ask people to face the facts. And they are very terrifying facts. I wish it was possible to say something more agreeable, but I must say what I think true. Of course, I quite agree that the Christian religion is, in the long run, a thing of unspeakable comfort. But it does not begin in comfort. It begins in the dismay I have been describing, and it is no use at all trying to go on to that comfort without first going through that dismay. In religion, as in war and everything else, comfort is the one thing you cannot get by looking for it. If you look for truth, you may find comfort in the end.